Well, thanks a lot for putting me on the program after those two recipients. What wonderful women. I kind of feel like the flame eater who follows the Self-Immolation Act, a little bit on the anticlimactic side, but I'm going to proceed anyway. I know it's traditional for the guy in my spot to start off by saying how pleased he is to be here. So, I'm pleased to be here. But I say it not because it's a thing to say, but for two very specific reasons. First off, it's been my experience that any time you meet with a group like this, you're talking with some of the most literate, best-read people that a region has to offer. So I would be willing to bet that virtually everybody in the room has a copy of the works of some of this guy. West Hills native, went on to incredible fame. I hope that many of you may have a book by this woman who grew up in Selden, played on the Newfield High men's hockey team, went on to break down gender doors left and right in the sports world, and is now the second most rated, highly rated anchor on ESPN. And without doubt, all of you are familiar with this classic piece of American literature by another New Yorker, not Long Islander, but a New Yorker. Everybody got it, right? Where John Agee explores the wonderful world of oxymorons, those phrases, the first part of which directly contradict the second. And after having reviewed all those in use today, he has identified the top 10, and here they are. So here you are on an otherwise perfectly good Friday morning, having to confront two of those without benefit of a third. So if I detect a high number of alleged important phone calls requiring people to leave the room, I get it. But I hope you're going to hang around because we're going to look at early education, early learning in a different perspective. I said there were two reasons I was glad to be here. The other one is this. When I put the company together 20 years ago, it was to do this: provide effective, differentiating, and innovative strategic support to organizations and companies, but only those that met three criteria. We support the causes, we respect the integrity, and the leadership has no sense of complacency. That eliminates a lot of folks. This is not the only time you're going to hear the word complacency from me this morning. So, anytime we get an invitation to work on a project or meet with some people, we ask ourselves, they meet the criteria. So the invitation comes in from Janet. Actually, it wasn't so much an invitation, it was, Millett, we want you to come up in June. Did I make that clear? But anyway, the invitation comes up, and two words immediately come to mind. Is this the kind of organization that I want to work for? Two words were for sure. Actually, there were three words: for damn sure. Because this is a special organization. It recognizes that early learning is a very complex matter with many moving parts. You know, I suspect if I lived in New York and had, followed the various duels between your governor and the mayor of New York City over the last year or so, it'd be very easy to think that early learning is universal pre-K. Well, that's part of it. That's an important part of it, but that's just a part of it. There's a lot more involved. And from the standpoint, when you go online to the Early Learning Council here in Suffolk, and Child Care Council here in Suffolk, and you take a look at the variety of support that they give to center providers and to parents and to kids, they get it. And particularly, it's already been cited this morning, Parent Leadership Initiative. This is exactly the sort of organization, and Janet is exactly the sort of person that we want to work for. Fanny Glover of the New York Early Care and Learning Council had told me about Janet and her compatriot Jan Barbieri from the neighboring county and the work they did. So I am glad to be here. We talked about Governor Cuomo briefly. Let me pose another former New York governor. I think he went on to do something else after he was finished here, I forgot. But he made this statement one time. And that's what the people in this room are all about, building our kids for the future. In terms of construction, that's where that begins. As was already alluded to, it ain't high school. It's not middle school. It's not elementary school. It's the earliest years of life. And that's why the case we're here to make this morning, when we say that everyone has a stake, in early learning? Everyone? That's what I mean. Everyone. I don't care who you are. If you're in this room, if you're not in this room, if you're an American citizen, you have a stake in this issue. Most of my work's in the corporate sector. We work with organizations, corporations are looking for the right place for new or expanded locations or to differentiate themselves from the competition. Those companies look at every issue from this perspective. Already alluded to this morning. Virtually everything is global. The smallest jeweler in Islip has got global competition because the odds are before some guy buys his gal an engagement ring or buys an expensive watch for his son or daughter for graduation, they're going to check what the price is here, and then they're going to go online and see where can I get it cheaper, or where can I get a better one for the same price. Everything is global. So from that perspective, we're meeting here this morning. But from the issue of early learning, that's irrelevant. I mean, I greatly appreciate the law school for hosting us, but that's not the perspective from which to watch early learning. Pull back a little bit, irrelevant. Maybe. Now we're starting to get the picture in a literal sense. When you look at early learning in Suffolk County, New York, here, but this is the right perspective. And when we see what's happening with America's kids, it's got to be evaluated in terms of what else is going on in the world. That world, the world that virtually everybody in the room that grew up in, relatively stable in terms of our kids, that world has been shattered. It's been replaced by one that looks like this. Every day, if you're an organization, if you're a corporation, whatever you are, whatever your size, there are challenges that could not be anticipated 5 or 10 years ago, and perspectives that have changed considerably. Things are very changeable. Peter Drucker is a name that may be familiar to many of you, the father of modern management. Of all the things he had to say, nothing is more relevant to today's conversation than this. The greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence. It is to act with yesterday's logic. And I want to suggest, without fear of successful contradiction, that across this country there are too many people in positions of importance who are using yesterday's logic, if they are using logic at all, to look at the issue of early learning. Our nation is getting its butt kicked educationally. And there are too many of us who, hey, we're America. We're God's chosen people. Stand back, world. We're coming through. If we're talking about preparing our kids and our companies and our communities for tomorrow, then the logic we need to use is not yesterday's logic, not even today's logic, but tomorrow's logic. Tomorrow's logic suggests that we need to do three assets we need to do very closely. One, do we honestly look at ourselves in the mirror and understand what we're looking at? What's our insight on ourselves? What's our internal strengths and weaknesses and our external opportunities and threats? Second one is in terms of foresight. If we're using a pair of binoculars and the competition has got one of these, we're in a world of hurt. Ideally, we want to position America, on the matter of education and learning in general, as the Hubble of nations. We can see further than anyone's. We know what's coming. We can take the steps in 2015 that position America for greatness in 2035. That does no good if you're not agile. You've got to be, if you know what's coming at you, you can't do anything about it. What the heck? How agile are we? Well, let me tell you where I see a lot of companies, a lot of states right now on the matter of early learning, and a lot of people who represent us in DC. In terms of insight, it looks like this. Little pussycats who see tigers staring themselves back and lions back in the mirror. In terms of foresight, we have too many people who can't see past the next quarterly report. Too many people whose relevance of an issue only has to do with how does that affect my election status next time around. And in terms of agility, we look like this. Exhibit A in terms of agile organization. Congress, so badly divided. Too often putting ego and party first and country third, a distant third. It makes you wonder what some of our great leaders would have thought of that. I suspect their reaction will be something like this. Now, this is not just learning. The corporate world is full of, there are examples of names that we grew up with. Let me ask you, whatever happened to these people? There are 9 companies that at one time were in the first or second position in their marketplace. They had that in common. And what do they have in common now? That. And there are others on the cusp. Anybody in the audience carrying one of these with them this morning? Come on, you're out there, own up to it. Nobody? Okay. Well, in terms of how quickly things can happen, 2009, we're not talking ancient history here, folks. 2009, BlackBerry, the blue line there, had almost a 45% share of the U.S. smartphone marketplace. Look how they've declined. And a year and a half ago, they said, my gosh. They came out with new products too late. Goes like that. Now less than a 3% share. They're trying to build on the matter of security and bring themselves up, and maybe they will. But things happen fast in the world. It happens to companies, and it happens to countries. There are countries that look like images like this, and these are the words that come to mind. We are citizens of such a country. There are other countries where people look at images like that and recognize this. You know what that is, don't you? On academic and educational matters, that's a used to be. We used to be number 1 by most measures. This book tracks the historical education progress of the country. Halfway through last century, we had 70% of our upper teenagers in some sort of secondary education. The closest European country was about 30%. Now, part of that had to do with recovery from World War II. But we were head and shoulders above everybody. We used to be number 1. Used to be if you headed over to Toro Law Center and you had a Commodore 64, you were state of the art. 64K of memory, what can I do with all of that? Used to be if you took a picture, it was recorded on something called film or I don't know what the name was. It used to be that the land on which Brookhaven now sits was the home of a military installation that sent troops to both World War I and World War II. Used to be. I'm a baseball guy. Used to be that my team was full of promise. And the team that plays on the western tip of Long Island kind of sucked. Used to be. That worm has turned. No yays and applause needed on that, please. That used to be. Well, that worm has turned too. Show you some numbers we are today in terms of educational measures. How you like the sounds of USA, USA? We're number 14. Or we're number 17. Or we're number 25. If those were world soccer rankings, it wouldn't bother me a bit, but that's not what they are. Every 3 years, there's an international analysis of how 15-year-old skills compare on 47 countries. 14th in terms of reading, science, math. That places us in this distinguished company. So most of those are nice places to visit, but that's not the educational company I want to keep. If we want to move those numbers upward, as has already been alluded to several times this morning, we need to know what the starting line is. Starting line is right here. It's before pre-K. Now, there are some people out there, you hear a lot of this. Well, you know, there's a reason our numbers are low. We got those poor kids pulling us down. Our middle income kids, we're great. Our smart kids are great. And we do have great kids in America, a lot of smart ones. Which is why this analysis was so important. It took a look at it disaggregated the national data and found out that from a standpoint of looking at income levels across countries, our middle income kids are getting beat by middle income kids in other countries, and in some cases by low income kids in other countries. So the guy there on the left needs to wipe that smile off his face. He needs to change his shirt, and he needs to pull his head out of the sand. In fact, I'm in Long Island. I want to change that slide. That's the way we'd say it in North Carolina. You know, we're polite, we're nice. We'll stab you in the back behind your face, but we're real nice to you up front. Let me give you the Long Island translation as to where this guy has his head. You hear this phrase a lot, particularly during election time, American exceptionalism. And I yield to no one in the room in terms of love of country. There are many good things about our country. But I also yield to no one in the room in terms of disappointment in country. Because when I think of American exceptionalism, two things that come to mind: we're exceptionally divided. Where are the people who consider country first? Who are not trying to score points off the opposition? You know, we need to change, apparently, our national motto. Out of many one, we're still many. We've always been having different perspectives, but the one, we're not even close anymore. There's something else that we are: exceptionally complacent. This report, A Nation at Risk, talked about if a foreign country tried to impose the educational system that we have today, we could consider that an act of war. That didn't come out last week, last month, last year, last decade. That came out in 1983, in the first term of this man, issued by a commission appointed by President Reagan. And since then, on a regular basis, we've had a series of reports that talk about where American education is positioned. This one, put out by a number of companies, included then the executive director of the National Association of Manufacturers, said this. That's the opening sentence. And this is the second sentence. No longer are we the best and the brightest. In 30 years, we've gone from almost 30% of college students to less than 14%, and dropping fast. These men and women serving on there gave their best thinking to it and came up with 16 recommendations as to what we need to do to change this around. There is no statement in that report that says if you get early education right, everything else comes into play, and that's not the case I'm making today. It's not that we put all the money into early learning and then we're good to go. That's not it. But it is this. You want to start investing. This is one of the best places because the benefits that accrue here will continue throughout a lifetime. But we've never ponied up in that regard. We've never committed that. This is an analysis 2 years ago of the, well, you can read it yourself. Adult population with post-secondary education. Can you see the blue line in the back of the room? That's the U.S. position by different age groups. This age group, still at the top. And that's something you'll see in most cases where America stands pretty high on education is because of us old-timers. We're carrying the weight for you younger guys, younger gals. We're making you look good. You drop down, we start to fall. And then you go younger, we fall farther still. And we'll take a look at some comparative data on millennials a little bit later that's even more disturbing. Now, what does that suggest about America's future 25, 30 years out? Interesting to note that in each of those cases, our percent is about 40%. So we have not declined relative to ourselves so much as we have the rest of the world. So here's Uncle Sam treading water. Here comes the world. This clock has been going off a while now. Time to act. And what do? We keep hitting the snooze button. And you know what happens when you snooze? We need to take that sense of complacency, knock it out, and replace it with a sense of urgency. The urgency that many of you people in the room have, and I greatly appreciate that. Because this issue, it's about their individual futures as kids and as adults, but there's more at stake here than that. We're also talking about the long-term economic vitality of Suffolk County, of your state, and as was alluded to earlier, our nation. That's what's in play here. The game has changed. Those young kids of today, their world's going to be different. It's going to be more competitive than anything any of us have ever encountered. When I was growing up in Aiken, South Carolina, my competition was other kids in the Carolinas, maybe the Atlantic seaboard. The competition, who's got a young child or a young grandchild? What? Okay, how the 3-year-old son or daughter? Okay, and what's your 3-year-old's name? Riley, great name, okay. Riley's competition is going up there on at least 4 or 5 other continents. She better be ready in a way that her mom didn't have to be. No offense meant whatsoever. You want to take a look at Riley's competition? Among other places, look here and here, and recognize if you take the 28% of the smartest kids in India or the 25% of the smartest kids in China, that's more smart kids than we have kids. Think about that for a minute. That's Riley's world. So the next time you drive around and you see that bumper sticker, no, I did not come up 2 days earlier to find that. That is Photoshop. That's the only Photoshopped image you'll see in this show. But if you see something that looks like that, feel good for that family. But recognize those other countries have more honor students than we have students. When I was growing up, the game was fairly simple. In terms of influence, it was us versus the Soviets. In terms of the economy, parts of Asia, parts of Europe, they're pretty simple. Here's Riley's world. Everybody has pieces in play. And the competition looks like this. You can't talk about early learning without talking about neuroscience to a certain degree. And as a young dad, many years ago, many years ago, I thought I had the neuroscience thing down pat. I mean, I looked at my son and, you know, there was the patient center, the cooperation center. And then there was this center. And he had plenty of opportunities to build his vocabulary. And then we had this in the super turbocharged center. But I found out later, not that simple. And particularly when you're talking about workforce skills, neuroscience is important. In this book, Tony Wagner, the author, interviewed more than 2,000 major employers across the country. Most of them were private sector, military was involved in there, and asked them, what aren't you seeing in your workforce that you need to see? 7 things were identified, those 7. Without exception, each of those can be promoted or stymied in the earliest years. When a young child is born, there are about 125 billion cells in their brain. To put it in context, that's about the number of known stars in the Milky Way galaxy. In the first few years of life, there are 700 neuronic connections made between those cells every second, which means when you go home tonight and you give Riley a hug, her brain is different in 26,143 ways than it was when you kissed her goodbye this morning. what happens in those earliest years literally affects the architecture of the brain. Here are two brains. The one on the left is a young child, PET scan, child that's been nurtured, read to, all that sort of thing. The one on the left pretty much ignored. Architecture is different. So if you're an employer out there and you want a workforce that fires on all cylinders, don't forget where that starts. It starts here. And in a very real way, what happens in the first 2,000 days of life affects the 25,000 that follow. And if you're a business person and you ask yourself, well, it all sounds nice, but is there really a return on investment? You're damn right it is, and it's been proven time and time again. And you don't have to be Sherlock Holmes to scope it out. Number of studies, and I'm not going into detail here. A study that's run for more than 40 years that divided two groups of African American kids in Ypsilanti, Michigan, and tracked them. One group was given state-of-the-art at the time, cognitive development. Their parents were worked with very closely. Other group, here's your graham cracker, take a nap. The kids that got the better development, they earn more money, they're better educated, they have fewer kids out of wedlock, they do more of the good stuff and less of the bad stuff. Study that replicated that in North Carolina, Chicago, and I hate to reference New Jersey. They got bridges all screwed up, but this is one thing they got right. If you're not familiar with Apple's preschool, you should be. This was a court-ordered case that required schools in low-income parts of New Jersey to provide 3 and 4 and 5-year-old pre-K for the kids. More than 40,000 kids have gone through that program now. And the staying power of the quality of early education has been documented. And then we have this, good New York company. IBM, every several years, has major interview with employers. You can see the number of people who are involved here, asking them, what do you need to see in your leadership going forward? And the word that always comes up is creativity. The important reason for this. We always hear about the knowledge economy, right? Knowledge. It ain't the knowledge economy going forward for this reason. Have you heard the term obsolete? Obsolete is a contraction of obsolete and knowledge. And it is a recognition that so much of what you learn at one point changes. That too much of American education, and mine was, I'll tell you that, when I took a test, I memorized something for 3 days, I vomited it out on the test, and then 3 days later, I had no idea what it was. This is not the knowledge economy going forward. It's the thinking economy. What skills are kids learning now that will help them cope with change, anticipate change, apply some of their knowledge, develop new knowledge, and establish a whole new state of understanding what's going on? To that mind, you would think, well, that puts us in a great position because American ingenuity has always been widely respected. We're in great shape there. Well, that would be true except for this. There are ways of measuring creativity. And 3 years ago, for the first time, American scores started dropping on that. We got too many kids, I think, who, like me, will look at their cell phone half the time, have no idea how to put a cell phone together because it's been manufactured elsewhere. We need kids who can think, not who can memorize. Kids who look at a challenge, something like this, and figure out, okay, what's the best perspective here? Maybe it's something like this. Or kids who are given the challenge, okay, what's the best way to take that cheese off there? Do I try to sneak it off, or do I throw my buddy on the trap and then I get the cheese? Or maybe I do something like this. We need to recognize where the idea tap is turned on. It's turned on there. And incidentally, sometimes you think creative thinking and that's the light bulb. What's the problem with that image? Those are old light bulbs. Nobody uses that stuff anymore. You can't even buy it at certain wattages, but they still use wattage. We need kids beyond that. This is what we're looking for, state of the art. So with all the evidence out there, you would think, okay, well, we must have appropriate funding for early education. One thing I love about Janet, I used the term complacent a little while ago. On my list of 500 adjectives to describe Janet Wallerstein, complacent ain't on it. She's fought that battle in terms of subsidy that's appropriate for Suffolk County, as many of you may have as well. But despite all the arguments on behalf of early education across the nation, it's a tight deal. Not much going in there. And again, putting it in a comparative basis, the study that looked at where do we stand in terms of our early education support. This report's just a year and a half old. It ranks early education and early learning by a number of criteria, where we stand in terms, affordability, availability, and quality. USA, we're number 24. Now, why is that? Beyond our complacency, I think there are a couple of things. Brookings Institute got it right. The payoff from investments in early education, early learning, come down the road. There's not immediate gratification. And political systems are biased against that sort of thing, which means that we are. If somebody doesn't, if a legislator in most of the country now opposes early learning or does not support it, there are no political consequences to that. Ain't that big a deal. I guarantee you if there was an elected official in North Carolina or New York or elsewhere who was defeated because the early learning community and the business community rose up against him or her and defeated him, that would grab some attention. But right now, it's not really, where we win, they're small wins. I love that often you hear this argument in terms of the problem with, and when I say a conservative North Carolina legislator, that is redundant. I'm not opposed to, there's wisdom on both the liberal and the conservative side of the table. I'm not anti-conservative. But you usually hear from the conservative crowd in North Carolina, we need to run government more like a business. Well, any business that was as short-sighted as we have been on education would no longer be in business, and we looked at 9 of them a little while ago. If we want to be optimistic about Uncle Sam's future, we need to be optometrists today and help him get over his myopia. Now, two other reasons, though, that we have not been very successful in advocating early learning. Let me ask you a question. Now, when you know the answer to this, do not blurt it out. Just raise your hand. Okay? Where are you? No hands yet. Okay. Got a hand? Got a hand over the corner? All right, put them up when you recognize where we are. Okay. Keep them up. Okay. I asked you where you are. We're right here. Okay? Now, how come it took so long to recognize that? Because I only showed you a few pieces at a time, right? That's what early learning does. It's only shown a few of the multiple value propositions. Before I go there, though, let me go here. Suppose I'm planning a family vacation. Okay? And I write to Long Island and say, what is there to do on Suffolk County? They're likely to send me a booklet. I open it up, it looks like this. There's a lot to do in Suffolk County. I'd want to go there. But suppose I opened the book up and all I saw was this. 9 variations on the Montauk Lighthouse. I would think, is that all you got? I ain't going there. We got lighthouses in North Carolina. That's what early education has done. You go to any site, any argument, there are pictures like that. And that's not to put the quietus on the cover of your annual report, which is very nice. But the problem with that is it only shows one value, doing it because it's the right thing for kids and families. That's a nice warm and fuzzy. Does anybody think this is a warm and fuzzy world? It's not. To be effective in mobilizing, and use the word that Matt, where's Matt? that Matt used last night very appropriately of galvanizing people to take action in the heading of early learning. We need to show some of that, but also a lot of this. The connection between early learning and workforce development, community development, and economic development. And two arguments that are seldom put out front but need to be, particularly with conservative audiences, the role of early learning in terms of public safety and in terms of national security. Cases that are made by the right kind of folks. And here's what I mean by the right kind of folks. The third problem that early learning has had is they've not used the right advocates. Suppose next Sunday, Chuck Todd had these two people on his show. My apologies for that slide. There's a major problem with it. Anybody see it? Boehner on the left, Pelosi on the right? I don't think so. So we'll correct that. Okay, thank you. And he asked them, is the country better off now than it was 7 years ago? Would either of those individuals say a single thing that would catch you by surprise? Not a single syllable. They are lousy at getting people to change their minds. They are great at raising the fury within the people who are already on board. But too often, early educators have put themselves out front and advocating the importance of what they do. That would be like me trying to sell my company by myself. Somebody comes up and says, Bill, we're thinking of undertaking a major strategic initiative. Is your company any good? Damn right we are. We're the guys for the... What do you expect me to say? When early educators meet with people, with legislators and elected officials and business people who are neutral or negative on the issue, they have limited credibility, if any at all, because they're so vested in it. So typically what you see is something like this. It's a great statement in terms about where all of workforce skills, all of life skills begin. Developed during childhood, starting at birth. The problem with this report is this, the author. So you're telling me that the Harvard Center on Developing Child says that developing children is important. Yeah. Kind of reminds me of a television ad that's being shown now. Yeah. The people who need to be out front, those of you in the business community, you're part of it. U.S. Chamber of Commerce, several years ago, came out with their foundations of workforce development. Said there were 4 pillars. You see what the first one is. Everything follows that early learning. Which means the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is officially on record as saying this, that all of that starts right here. You get that part right, then outcomes like this become more predictable and less expensive to society. So when you have somebody like the Long Island Association involved, that is heavy. That is great stuff. Can we get them to the idea now is let's translate that into action that has a payoff down the road. U.S. Chamber of Commerce, if you doubt what they're saying, this report is available online. It's important because of this. There are only 4.4% of us Americans as the world's population. Only 74% of us have a high school degree. A third of us that are in college are in some sort of remedial education, which makes me wonder how'd they get a high school degree in the first place? Was that social promotion? What is it? What really are their skills? So if we are underpopulated and we are also underskilled, the future of America is grim. And I don't think that's an overstatement. Robin Li, founder of Baidu, which is the Chinese Google, one of those many foreign nationals who came over here, took advantage of our post-secondary educational system, which is superb, then returned home, established Baidu, came back to Stanford, where he got his undergraduate degree 2 years ago, and said this. Now, there's a lot more to learning and creative thinking than the internet, but his point is well taken. But not many of us. We have no American child to waste. Every American child is entitled to the best opportunity to make the most of what his or her abilities are. Another group that's on board is the Business Roundtable, the bluest blue chip of corporate America. You can see what they look like in terms of the number of people they employ, their payrolls, their philanthropic contributions. They say this: return on investment in quality early education is linked to the quality part of it. And they have a definition of quality. It's this: the primacy of the parents recognizing that early learning is part of an academic trajectory, where every level builds on the strengths or the weaknesses of the level that preceded it. Which is why the Quality Stars program in New York is so important from my standpoint. Giving parents the ability to distinguish between care and quality care. Then we have the Committee for Economic Development, academic and business leaders. You can see some of the names there. They got their start right after World War II. The first project was putting together the specifics of the Marshall Plan. Here's the business they're in. Take a close look at the last two. They've issued a series of reports now for 10 years on this. The most recent one was this: America at the Crossroads. And we're behind. You hear a lot these days about STEM education, particularly here, very near Brookhaven. This is a challenge for us, and this is not to suggest that America does not need young kids to grow up to be educators, historians, poets, whatever. They'll always be important parts of the American fabric. But let's take a look at where where our college kids, the majors, compared to other countries. The percent of American kids engaged in disciplines in science and engineering is that. Thank God we allow immigrants into our country. Look at some of these numbers. That's the one that bothers me the most. The majority of PhD recipients on American campuses 2 years ago are foreign nationals. They used to stay here and become part of us. Now, increasingly, they go back home, in some cases because of our visa programs, in some cases because there are opportunities there that their fathers and mothers and grandparents did not have, and they become part of the competition. Did anybody watch the spelling bee on ESPN last week? I couldn't even pronounce the name of 90% of the kids on there. They're all first-generation Americans whose parents are driving them to greatness. If you see some of the same things in terms of science competitions, it's the same thing. It's that next generation, the first generation of Americans who cherish the opportunities they have here. But where are the rest of us? We're on our damn cell phones that we don't understand how they work. But we have gotten complacent. The evidence is everywhere. Now, you might look at this and say, okay, I get the point, but how does that relate to early learning? Does it have a relevance? This group thinks so. They foresee an America where all kids are exposed to STEM in the earliest years. They may not be interested, but they have a chance to look at it. Is this for me? In fact, the National Science Foundation says this. And we're not talking about teaching advanced calculus to 3-year-olds. We're talking about exposing them to things. Yet taking them outside. Not every kid has that opportunity. It makes you wonder how much untapped talent we will waste, that we have wasted. People who could have grown up to be great Americans who never had the support system to do that. What's the cost of that kid, that family, our nation? Here are 3 major corporations who agree with this perspective. before kindergarten. What's the slogan they use here at Brookhaven? What do they talk about? Where does that passion start? I don't know what that little one just saw, but I have a feeling it's going to stay with him or her for life. That's the sort of thing that needs to be encouraged wherever possible. I talked about the millennials a little bit earlier this morning. Where do we stand? You know, there's kids who, when my computer crashes, I don't know what to do with it, but hey, Ken, come on up here. How does that fix this? Those kids are bright. They're bright compared to us, which is setting the bar pretty low. Let's look at them in a global standpoint. This report came out in January of this year. Compared the millennials, and by millennials I'm talking 16 to 35, how the American millennials compare to millennials elsewhere. Other 22 countries we're looking at, 21 other countries. And here's what it showed. That PSTRE in the last bullet there stands for problem solving in a technology-rich environment. Last of 22. All those bright Americans, let's look at them globally. And then you think our best and brightest can compete with anybody? Let's look at our best and brightest millennials. What does that suggest for America in 2035? Or America in 2065? Or at the dawn of the next century? Remember when Tom Brokaw wrote The Greatest Generation about our parents and our grandparents? They didn't get everything right. Racial equality, gender equality, there was a lot of work to be done, and we made some progress in that regard. But in terms of the ultimate measure of generation is what does it leave behind for the generation that comes after that? We are on the precipice of becoming the first generation to leave a lesser America behind in the context of a global world. So if Tom Brokaw's great-grandson is going to write a book 100 years from now about us, what's the title? What generation are we? When it comes to investments, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about putting your own money into stocks or bonds or debentures, or the public's money into quality early learning. The issue is exactly the same. What's the return on investment? We need to position early learning as the bull market. And there's some people who can help us there, including the Federal Reserve Board. It says the return on investment from early learning is extraordinary, not a phrase that the Federal Reserve throws around a lot. They're basically saying if you want pictures like this in your future, you need pictures like this in your present. And a case was made, convincingly, that the highest return on investment comes from early on. That's not to put down the importance of K through 12 and post-secondary, it is this. It doesn't cost that much to get the start right. And what happens at the start follows the child throughout his life. Return on investment is extraordinary. The reason that I cite this one, this is not something I came up with, something this guy came up with. Dr. James Heckman. Dr. James Heckman, University of Chicago. Dr. James Heckman, University of Chicago, 2000 Nobel laureate in economics. You want to argue this point with me, you bring your guy, my guy's better. Came up here from Charlotte, North Carolina, which is the financial center. Bank of America is headquartered there. East Coast headquarters of Wells Fargo is there. Now, this is a phrase you hear a lot around there, patient capital. And by that, you're talking about investments that you make today that you don't expect a quick return on. You don't want a quick return on. But the potential for payoff is so substantial that you're willing to invest. A lot of people think, well, you know, that's the phrase that applies to quality early learning. You got to wait a while. And to a certain degree, that's true. But there's also a payoff from quality early learning today. And it's this: workforce productivity. If you're an employer out there and you have a lot of young parents in your workforce, these are among the problems that you encounter. There have been studies that have shown for those companies that make arrangements for their parents, maybe it's an in-house child care center, which is not practical for most people, I know that. But maybe it's allowing a work-life balance that ensures that they have an opportunity to inspect where their kids are going to for early learning. They have that sort of thing. They've been able to reduce those problems. So there is a bottom line payoff today. And there's another one, and I saw this in action last week. 2 companies going after an incredibly talented 28-year-old mother. The one that won was the one who emphasized this. So if you're in competition with somebody and you're looking for the best talents you can get, there is a payoff today in terms of understanding that work-life balance and the way that child care fits in that equation. So we know what American business leaders think of, by and large. A lot of them think in terms of the importance of early learning. It's a big one of those. Well, who else is involved? How about these men and women? More than 5,000 law enforcement officers, crime victims, and district attorneys. This report 2 years ago said this. Okay, well, what's the early learning connection here? It's that. And the fact that 70% of incarcerated Americans do not have a high school degree, and the law enforcement community thinks that quality early learning is the best way to move those numbers up. And incidentally, you want to look at a place where USA, we're number 1% of population incarcerated. Nobody is even close. To put that in a little bit broader context, this report just last year looked at different ways America could spend its money. $75 billion a year. $75 billion a year is what the states and the federal government spend on incarceration on an annual basis. These men and women of law enforcement said, maybe there's a better way of looking at this. Let's take that $75 billion, not spend it in 1 year, spend it in 10 years to increase the quality and the availability of early learning. Then the difference is between 2 million extra Americans incarcerated, and 2 million extra Americans with skills to avoid incarceration, to avoid becoming tax consumers and be tax generators. And then there's another group that talks about the importance of early learning. I talked about national security. Men and women. 350 retired admirals and generals who have put their lives on the line for the rest of us and put our kids' lives on the line. You can see the business they're in. Ready, willing, and able to serve. Talked about the percent of Americans 17 to 24 who cannot qualify for military service. Anybody care to guess what that percent is? Anybody guess this high? Wow. That is not to insult the men and women like the Lieutenant Colonel who have served us. It is to their credit. They wanted to make an investment in their country to continue our legacy of greatness. But there are not many like the Colonel out there. Too many. Uneducated, arrested, out of shape, whatever. Because going forward, smart weapons alone are not enough. We need smart people. And then this report came out. It's not a Republican or Democratic thing. It's a common sense thing. Talked about American complacency. We've been complacent before. Some people in the room are old enough to remember a day in 1957. This was after, we had saved Europe's butt. America was on top of the world. When people aspired for greatness, they looked at us. And then one October day in 1957, we woke up to this headline. And for you younger people out there, that's how you got your news back then. You read it in a newspaper. And we recognized that those brave but alleged stupid Soviets had beat us into space. And around the world, the question was asked, is the American way really the best way? The next year, the Congress passed was something called the National Defense Education Act. Think of that for a minute. National Defense Education Act. And for the first time, the federal government started putting major federal funds into science and math. A number of federal agencies were coalesced around something called the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. And America went to work. Eventually, 400,000 of us working for 12,000 companies, universities, and others. Worked hard, but it was still 3.5 years later that we found out the first person in space was not going to be John Glenn or Gus Grissom or Alan Shepard, but Yuri Gagarin of the Ukraine. But we kept at it. And eventually the American answer was delivered in July 1969. The launch of Apollo 11. A 3-stage rocket, and the payoff was this. USA, we are number one. Look at the image on the left now. Let me make an educational analogy rather. Early learning is the launch of kids into an academic trajectory. The payload here is an American workforce that can compete with anyone and beat most. Launches are critical in space or in education. When a space launch fails, there are consequences. Challenger, 73 seconds after launch. 7 American lives lost, American prestige damaged, space program put back, technology hurt. 17 years later, and yeah, it was 17 years later, another problem. Columbia broke apart, coming back to Earth. You might ask, well, is that really a launch problem? Yeah, because if you remember it or if you don't, what happened at the launch of Columbia, a piece of foam fell off the fuel tank, cracked the leading edge of the shuttle itself. So when the shuttle re-entered Earth 3 days later, hot gases penetrated and another 7 American lives lost. Sometimes launch problems show up right off the bat, and sometimes it's down the road a ways. Same thing with early education. Failure to launch results in things like this. Lots of people without the skills to get a job today. Lots of places in this country with jobs available without people having the skills to fill them. High rates of poverty. High rates of incarceration. A heavy social carrying cost for the rest of us. And ultimately an American trajectory that in too many measures kind of looks like Columbia. But what's happened to us? I would suggest what's happened to us looks something like this. We've had no academic Sputnik moment. No educational Pearl Harbor. No scholastic 9/11. Nothing to shake us to our senses. Just a gradual erosion of the American position. But over decades, erosion starts looking like this. And that is a lousy foundation to build a future for those kids and that nation. When it comes to quality early learning, parent, grandparent, childless adult, child hater, Republican, Democrat, independent, small business person, major corporate executive. No matter who you are, you've got a stake in this game. The stakes are greater than too many Americans can even begin to conceive. And on this issue, America needs to be all in. Thank you.